16 True Short Horror Stories. It was Christmas Day and I was 9 when we drove to my grandparents' house. My grandparents lived in a community which was not gated, but still required you to drive through the entrance of the community and then turn right, drive down 2 blocks of houses, then turn left to get to the house. We had just turned right when we drove past a house that still had their Halloween decorations up. I pointed this out to my mom, and she told me not to look at the house anymore and to look straight ahead until we arrived at grandparents' house. Later on, I realized that the Halloween decoration of a life-sized man in a suit hanging by a rope from the tree in the front yard was no decoration. My wife had a miscarriage at 20 weeks. It was a girl and we were going to name her Samantha. A couple days later, my wife hears our 2-year-old daughter talking in her room in the middle of the night. She goes up and asks her what she's doing, and she replies, "I'm talking to Samantha, she's on the ceiling." So, I was walking home from college one afternoon. It's about a 2-mile walk between home and college. I'm on the outskirts of the town center and entering a busy neighborhood. Everything seems normal, until I start getting a creepy feeling, like I was being watched or something. So, I look around and what do I find? Literally, every person looking at me and watching me as I go past them. Even the people driving were looking at me as they went past. Like, there was this one guy who was turning the corner to come to the road I was about to cross. He was legit leaning over his seat to stare at me as he rounded the corner. Happened for the entire way home, but hasn't happened since. I was super freaked out. I did not tell my family or friends because they would think I'm crazy. It felt kinda like the world is a simulation. One reply to this story says, "They weren't staring at you, they were staring at what was following behind you." Astronaut Deke Slayton's red race plane was seen flying at John Wayne's airport during curfew, where aircraft were not allowed to take off before 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., depending on the day. The airport's officials sent a letter about the noise to Deke's home, and it was received by his very confused widow. Apparently, Deke had died many hours ago, and his race plane had been in a museum for years. My grandpa lived in an extremely rural, undeveloped area in the 40s to 50s when this occurred. Every time he would walk to school in the early morning, it would be pitch black, especially in the winter. There was this huge, old, unoccupied house that he'd walk by each morning, and each morning, he'd see the entire house light up as if they were automatic lights or something, inside flapping all the light switches. The thing was, it was an ancient house in which no one lived, but more important in my opinion, electric lights in every room were not a widespread thing where he lived, even in houses with living occupants. Another one. My dad, his 2 brothers, and his parents. His father was the grandpa who walked by the haunted house, had their share of poverty at certain points in my dad's childhood, to the point where my grandpa ate shortening and cucumber sandwiches to save money, to the point where the family went fishing in the nearby lake so they could have dinner. Which take us into our next story. They were fishing for a good while with no bites. Suddenly, this random man appeared with a tiny fishing box, set up right next to them and started fishing. My grandpa would always emphasize how small the fishing box was, because he'd say the man took out a bucket, bait, tackle, etc. from it, like he was Mary Poppins. He very quickly pulled in a lot of fish, then, according to my grandpa, he pulled out a big knife and a board, cut and cleaned the fish, pulled out a big box, put the cleaned fish inside and gave the box to my grandpa. And then, he just left. They never saw him again. My grandparents and my dad think it was Jesus. I don't know what my uncles think. I never talked to them about it. Not sure of the veracity of these stories, but at least, with the second one, there were 3 people who very earnestly told me the same exact story. One afternoon in college, I came back from classes and decided to sit on the couch and have a snack. After that, I just passed out. I had a nightmare of some bloody-faced demonish thing screaming at my ear at the top of its lungs. I woke up and went about the rest of my day. My roommate comes back later that night and goes to his room as I'm sitting in the main living room. At some point, he lets out this random startling scream. which leads to me running down the hall to see what's going on. He looks at me and says, "I swear to God, someone with a bloody face just walked from your bedroom into the bathroom." I never told him about my nightmare I had earlier in the day. I did not sleep for 2 days. Nothing ever happened. When I was in college, I house sat for my parents. I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, so I locked every door leading up to the bedroom when I went to bed at night. I had the weirdest dream that someone unlocked each door and turned on every light. It felt cold and woke up to my dog barking. All of the lights in the house were on and every door unlocked. My dog would not start barking at nothing in the hallway. I sat in the shower with my dog and the phone the rest of the night, scared to death. In the house I grew up in, it always felt like we were being watched. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye and dark mist that would dissolve when you looked straight at them. My older sister was always scared of the attic, especially. She would barricade the door when we were left home alone. I went to the attic quite often to get various things. It's where we kept large toy containers, old clothes, and stuffed animals. And I just liked seeing what I could find. It always felt like I was being watched, though. One time, I went up there, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a large, translucent, alien-shaped, white head looking at me from behind a box. I froze, terrified, and locked eyes with it for a few seconds before it slowly lowered itself down to hide. I turned right back around and left, telling myself I've imagined it, but scared to go in the attic for years after that. I did not tell anybody for years. My parents eventually sold the home and we moved. I never felt the same way anywhere else I've lived. I used to have this reoccurring nightmare about this lizard man type monster who could see what I could see out of my eyes, so I'd run and hide and did not know where I was. But then, as soon as I peeked to see if I was safe, he'd know where I was. So, I'd have to leave that hiding spot, go find a new one, and then it would happen over and over and over again. A literal nightmare. Very Kafkaesque. But here's the real spooky part. I once mentioned the lizard man to my dad, and he got super white in the face, and his voice was all shaky, and he just said, "This dream took place at our house in East St. Paul, the one with the apartment right behind it." And I said, "Yes, that's where I always go to hide. How did you know that?" And he said, "I had the exact same dream." And I don't know if it was just the way he said it or the overall situation or both, but I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It's quite chilling. Used to work late shift as a classroom IT support for a college. We did not get a lot of high priority calls from night classes, so, among other duties, we get a lot of repairs and maintenance done that cannot be done when classrooms were in use during the day. I don't mind the dark, so I wasn't in the habit of turning lights in the classroom on if I was just going to do something real quick on the computer. Well, I had a ticket to install something on the instructor PC in a classroom I've never been to before. It's about 10 p.m. when I get around to this ticket, and I head into the room. I get about halfway across the room and suddenly freeze. The hair on my back of the neck is standing up, and I feel 100% I'm being watched. No, I'm surrounded. Then, as my eyes start to adjust, I see them. This entire classroom is encircled by hospital beds sticking out from the walls, and in every bed there's a person sitting up, looking right at me. I blurt out, "Holy ducking crap, I'm so sorry," before finally realizing they're all just plastic dummies and I'm in a nursing classroom. Currently on a night shift and shitting my pants. We have some travelers who moved into our business park 6 months ago. I'm the only guy in the office and we have a lot of equipment in here. I always shut all the blinds and just have the lights above my desk on. Basically, a week or two after these travelers moved on to our park, I saw shadows passing the windows because there are street lamps outside and the office is very dark. Anyways, I saw these shadows and I picked up my phone ready to call on call. The police. Anyone who would save me if stuff got weird. Anyways, as I picked up the phone, I got this weird feeling I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and the blinds behind me were open. There was a guy stood with his hands cupped around the window so he could see in. I jumped out of my damn skin. He just kept looking at me with the biggest, weirdest grin on his face. I pretended to start talking on my phone straight away, and he quickly disappeared. I got to work tonight for my first shift on my own, and the travelers are back. I'm dreading something similar happens. A girl I went to high school with vanished one day. From day one, everyone was telling the police her ex-boyfriend had something to do with it. She already had a restraining order because he held a knife to her throat and threatened to kidnap and kill her, but with no evidence they could not do a thing. Over the years, several people went to the police, saying he admitted to killing her, but they did nothing. He eventually got in trouble for threatening to kill another girl and choking her and went to prison for 3 years. After prison, he came back to town and eventually asked another ex for his ride home from a party. Then she went missing after that night, and they found her car burned and they arrested him again, as he had burns on his hands. A few months later, someone found a set of remains outside of town, and during the recovery, they found another set of much older remains. He killed them both, and the failure of our local police department caused the second girl to be murdered. When I was a kid, like 2-ish, I had this dream of a man I called Big Daddy, because he looked like a large version of my father. In the dream, he lifted me over his head, held me there for what seemed like a few seconds, and then dropped me. I recall the dream vividly, but not the aftermath, which my parents filled me in on. They heard a super loud thud come from my room, so they ran in and found me several feet away from my bed, and both my ears were bleeding. My bed was a car bed that was only about a foot off the ground, and it had walls on the side to prevent falling out of it. There was no way falling out of my bed would have made that loud of a noise, let alone the likelihood of me falling out of it to begin with. I'm pretty sure I was abducted. After that day, I had extremely vivid nightmares about Black Panthers, not sure why that creature, watching me from outside the window or in the house sometimes. They happened a few times per month and completely stopped when we moved. I remember those dreams more than any other dream I've ever had in my life. I tell this story all the time as my campfire ghost story, but I've always been tempted to get hypnotic regression therapy to see if I could look past the disguises of whatever it was in my dream, to see what really happened. Background: there's a compound near where I grew up that is supposedly decommissioned. AT&T Cold War Communications Center. It sits at the end of a dead-end road isolated from many houses nearby. On the outside, it looks small, mundane 2-story building. Nothing exciting at all. Until you find out the building is actually many stories deeper. The entire building rests on a bed of springs to absorb shock from explosions and features an underground parking structure adjacent. Over the years, there have been theories that it was a missile silo, UFC research center, and something about a dark cloud full of lightning hovering just above it on an otherwise clear day. The X-Files part. Prior to decommission, you could drive down the road until you almost reached a guard station. I say almost, because doing so would result in being engulfed in floodlights with a military-type security team, armed to the teeth with assault rifles demanding you turn around immediately. As far as I know, no one to this day knows what really went on in there, or what the inside looks like. My grandparents had a big farm when I was growing up, and all the grandkids would help work with it over the summer when we were out of school. Anytime we saw a rabbit, we were supposed to get with the hoe or grab the shotgun. I was around 12 or so when I saw a little rabbit in the beans, and I did not want my grandfather to see it, so I chased it off. I followed it into the bush on the land for whatever reason. I just kept following it because usually I'd lose sight of them pretty quickly once they hit the brush. Kept following it until I found what was clearly an old barn ruin. These are pretty normal to happen upon where I'm from, and they're fun to look around inside, so I went in. It was weirdly kept up really well with antique tools in great shape and fresh hay. I worried I've crossed into neighbor's property, so I hightailed it out of there. I asked my grandfather about it. He said our land went way far past what I have described, and I could not have left our land in that short amount of time I was gone. So he followed me out there and we could not find it. I checked every summer and never found it again. Not creepy, but It always drove me insane where that stupid barn went. I went to boarding school that was in the woods in Idaho, in Bonners Ferry, which was like an hour or more from Coeur d'Alene. In one of the dorms, there was this 8-foot shadowy figure that would just stare at you sleeping from across the room. The ceilings weren't that high and there was a hunch to it, like the giant in Big Fish. I was there for 2 years and I saw it about a year in, but new kids on their first night saw it. Everyone knew. And if you got transferred to the dorm, then you were warned, in a joking way since we were kids. It's been 15 or so years and I still get goosebumps writing that out. Of course, story going around, it was just a really tall staff member named Jeff that committed suicide when he was just making sure you were asleep. So, that's what we named it. Jeff. Also, on my first month in, I was in a different dorm, top bunk in the middle of the room. I was taking a nap with my arm hanging off the side. I don't remember what I was dreaming about, but this remembers clear as day. Just a cat hissing and then screaming, and someone bit my finger. Hard. Hard enough to bruise under my nail. I was totally alone in the dorm, and I was sleeping on my stomach, arm dangling so it wasn't me doing it in my sleep. The dorms were separated by one half wall, and I got up, checked it thinking someone ran over there and was just screwing with me. And then there was a bang on the wall from on my bunk, again, totally alone. I can't speak for this because it was in the girls' dorm, but they had a little girl that would run through the dorm, bathroom screaming and leaving behind wet footprints. The dorm was by our little pond, and when we were out there, some girls came out screaming in towels saying, "It happened." A female staff went in and checked it out, and I remember when she came out, she had the expression that kind of looked like a half smile that said, quote, "I don't know, I can't explain it." And she was like, "Yeah, there's child footprints in there." That was 16 stories that are sure to make your hair raise. Subscribe to the channel to avoid being haunted in the night. Midnight Monster has daily content on all the gruesome, blood-curdling, and just downright unexplained stories. So, stick around if you can stomach the scare. Or not.